Welcome back to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer, Brandon Jones, and myself, Dan Strafford. And on today's episode, we're going to discuss unlearning, a topic that you may see in psychology magazines, but also organizational leadership ideals and in the classroom as well. But first and foremost, I always like to check in first. Mike, how you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm recovering from our trip last week, which was exciting. Hopefully folks had a chance to listen to our South by Southwest EDU shows where we got a lot of value out of that visit, very zeitgeisty, as we like to say. And what's striking me as I continue to revolve around the sun on the earth is that the more I learn, the more I start to get interference from things I already learned. So I'm excited to lean into unlearning. Hopefully I'll unlearn a few things as we go along. But I do feel like when you're at those types of conferences where you're just sort of almost leaning into the experiences and like learning a lot of new stuff, it's always interesting to think about how that relates to whatever your prior knowledge was. And then hopefully, you ultimately come out for the better, which I think I did. So, I'm excited to lean into the unlearning.
Brandon, how about yourself?
Well, very merry unlearning to you. I so similarly, reflected last week on the South by pod. Lots to learn, and I think changing some of our perspectives on things. I think I always leave with some fresh ideas from there. I'll say this for unlearning because I think that there's it's not one-sided, the conversation on unlearning. I think today we'll probably get into both sides, but I'll say this: it scans great. Like it's
oh my God,
unlearning. Like, why has this never been a thing that we've talked about before? It's like it's just it's a great brand around unlearning.
Mm-hmm.
And Mike, would you be able and willing to define sort of the scope of what unlearning is and how we'll use it in context of today's episode?
Sure, I'm able to try to define it, and as Brandon mentioned, like it's a concept that's not without a little bit of controversy. So I think the high level idea of unlearning is that as new ideas are introduced, frequently they run counter to previous concepts, prior knowledge that you already had. So when you talk about new skill acquisition, increasingly that involves not just learning the new skills, learning the new competencies. It also frequently requires either reframing or, shifting to a different paradigm, which is one of the counterpoints that's out there that, you don't actually unlearn the old ideas. You just learn new frameworks that can kind of coexist, and you can shift from one sort of mode of understanding to another. But a lot of what made the idea novel and, why the language is so resonant is the idea that frequently to move forward, you have to almost unpack and unwind things that you had learned in the past to actually allow you to come at things fresh. Reminds me a little bit of, the great book, Zen Mind, Beginner Mind, where like a lot of, Eastern thought involves, coming at things as though you were a beginner. So like not allowing your prior knowledge to over-influence your understanding of what's fresh and what's emerging. I think we did pretty good work, digging up some research heading into this, which we'll share out, which I think shows the wide range of uses of this concept. But a lot of it has come out of organizational psychology and workforce development, where as folks are trying to learn new skills, frequently, particularly, retraining experts as their domain evolves is one of the primary areas where this concept has emerged. And to Brandon's point, like I do think the language is just pretty sharp. And we talk a lot about the power of learning versus, when we're talking about learning versus education, we don't talk about uneducation. Maybe we should. But I do think the idea that it's not only acquiring new knowledge, it's actually sort of reframing and potentially letting go of prior knowledge is a critical part to staying fresh and relevant. I thought there's a lot for us to talk about there.
Yeah, and we may want to just tease this out and come back to it, but I think the thing where it just may be that I don't understand the science well enough to know is whether unlearning actually happens or if it's actually just learning over things you've learned before, right? So like we've used the language of hooks before. Like it's not like you tear the hooks off the wall and you affix a new hook. It's that you hook a new hook to the old hook.
Right.
And so it has the same implications. At least this is my understanding of the literature that we read here. It has the same effect, arguably, as actually unlearning, which involves, in theory, maybe some jettisoning of things you've learned before. But I'm not sure actually that it is. That I think the controversy is a little bit around, is it actually unlearning?
Right.
Or is it just, sort of having a new sort of theory around some of the things that you thought that you've learned?
Yes. And I think the related question that raises is like the advantage of someone with prior knowledge versus the advantage of someone with no prior knowledge. So like the whole tabula rasa thing, like if there's no prior learning to interfere with the new acquisition, is that actually advantageous? So that like in some ways to move forward, one of the concepts around unlearning is that you actually need to almost get the experts to let go of prior knowledge. So almost to your point, remove the previous hook, particularly if the body of knowledge has evolved such that it would actually interfere, which I thought was interesting. There was an article from the New York Times about how doctors who've been in the field for, 30, 40 years, medicine is not frozen in time. So the stuff that you learned when you were first being trained as a doctor may no longer be relevant. And then, I remember talking about parenting with you, Brandon, and one of the things you brought up was like frequently the grandparents who are telling you how to parent haven't actually parented a child in 35, 40 or more years. And they're not really willing to let go of that knowledge, and they expect you to sort of accept it as gospel. So I do think there's an interesting point to unlearning that ties to an aging population and the idea that as we get older, in many ways, there's an even greater need to reacquire and update our knowledge. And at least historically, there's been a correlation between getting older and becoming more fixed in terms of understanding. So like how open is the aging population to lean into letting go of what they learned and reacquiring that knowledge through a fresh lens, I think is an interesting topic for us to understand.
Yeah, and I think it is that openness, right? It's you used the phrase unpacking, I think earlier, Mike, the sort of being willing to deconstruct is probably to me more interesting actually, and it's maybe because I'm not a neuroscientist, but more interesting than the neuroscience behind actually, is it that you're jettisoning old information and wiping the tabula clean and then applying new information, or is it in fact that you're just adding to learning that already is stuck in your brain somewhere? Like that's less interesting to me actually than just being open, doing the self-reflection, doing the self-interrogation, and say what I know to be fact either may no longer be or may never have been. I think that's at the core of unlearning, right? Sure. I think if we take the example from the health profession field, it talks about, we can get into this a little bit, but like talks about over prescribing drugs, and that there's very clear evidence that we should stop doing that. And yet doctors continue to do it. And the sort of thesis here is because it's what they've learned and it's hard for them to unlearn it.
Mm-hmm.
That said, like, I think I wouldn't want a doctor who has no experience, who's never gone to med school, who's never interacted with a human being. Like, I wouldn't want that person to be my doctor.
Right.
So I think that the best outcome is where you can take experts in their field who have a healthy relationship with their expertise, and to say, that what I once thought may no longer be the case. And so to be always having sort of a constant coding and recoding of what you think that
Mm-hmm.
Because, I think we made this point before, like the history of science is proving that what we once believed before is wrong.
Right.
Right. I mean, I'm being reductive, but like that, we should go into all the things that we know, assuming that we're going to learn things that complicate or complement or, in some way change in some degree our perspective on them. So
Mm-hmm.
that should, I think, be our default position.
Yeah, agreed. And I like where you're going too, just around maybe just extending a little bit on what you're talking about. Frequently the facts don't change, the theoretical frameworks that explain the facts change. So like, I think that's an interesting idea too. So it's sort of like Thomas Kuhn and the structure of scientific revolutions, which is, oh, that's serious, is sort of the notion of a paradigm shift. And like, as we continue to live longer and ideally stay like intellectually engaged and, staying aware of the evolution of the different fields and the body of knowledge that's emerging, frequently that involves, still understanding the same fundamental reckoning of the world around us, but then sort of broadening that perspective to incorporate like a different paradigm. And I think that's interesting because that then to me also ties to the notion of learning transfer, where like frequently you want to take what you already knew and then retain some of it when you sort of lean into the next mental model, the next cognitive framework that you're accepting of. But I think it requires experts to be a little more humble and open than perhaps some of the sort of public perception of expertise is. It's sort of accepting that even if I am a worldwide leader in cognitive neuroscience and I understand everything about how the brain correlates to motivation, for example, to understand that I need to approach that knowledge with humility, because to your point, I'm going to need to unlearn some of these things that I'm extremely confident about right now. Does remind me of like an organizational leadership article I was reading, might have been Adam Grant, or was someone who reminds me of Adam Grant, who was talking about how, you want to be led by leaders who have some self-doubt, like actually leadership when questioning their own authority, even if they come across as less confident, frequently they're more likely to be right. So like, I think there is it's almost like a cautionary tale, I guess, to a certain extent around unlearning, where like, if you think, and it's growth mindset, if you think you're done learning, you're actually wrong. Like you always need to be open to evolving your thinking over your life.
It does feel as though this ties into multiple topics we've covered here before. The generational aspect that you brought up, Mike, and as people do tend to age, they tend to become a little bit more fixed in their mindset and whether or not they can learn, always be learning, something Brandon, you champion, and we've talked about here on the podcast, that it's the constant education and learning of yourself that really matters. Growth mindset you just brought up, Mike. So there's a lot of pieces here that seem to tie to things we've discussed before. I am also intrigued the way Brandon is on how it actually works. And there are, some debates around that and how all these pieces come together. I want your take here, Mike, and if I'm taking us down a different pathway, feel free to negate this, but it's also a negative word, right? Unlearning has this negative sound to it. I do think it's sharp, and I do think it has a great trend to it, but it's a negative off the front for me. to think of unlearning, to losing knowledge in some way. Do you think that's something that plays in part of how people react to it, or do you think it's simply just me reacting to it the way I see it?
It reminds me of the non-obvious angle where like unlearning is surprising. So like learning is what everyone talks about, and sort of the positive additive aspect of acquiring new knowledge is generally the way people think about learning, which at times may sort of speed past the deeper understanding that all knowledge is flawed, and anything that you think you understood with certitude is likely to be shook at some point in the relatively near future, which I think coincides also with sort of the crisis of truth that we're in right now, where like people have trouble believing anything because it's hard to prove anything, and opinion winds up, persuasive and confident opinion winds up trumping everything. So I think it is a very it's a subtly profound idea, and I think it's a simple way to sort of play with the language to talk about unlearning as opposed to learning. Interestingly, though, it may be too simple in that in some ways you still have the prior knowledge, and you acquire new knowledge on top of it. I remember talking to a friend of mine, also, perhaps in his middle years, and he was talking about acquiring knowledge as being similar to barnacles accreting on the hull of a ship. So, like over the years, as your hull gets older, you have more and more layers of barnacles, and they start to interfere with each other. So, like, there is the other aspect of aging that is hard, where like it's almost that you've acquired so much factual knowledge that it starts to interfere. And I think that was another subtler aspect of unlearning, where like frequently the stuff you remembered from your past, if you could let it go, you'd be more apt to understand new knowledge with that beginner's mind. And just that book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, is very much something that I do think like a lot of the stuff that I like from Eastern thinking is about just being in the moment, and reminds me a little bit of Daniel Kahneman's work too, around thinking fast and slow, where like the focus mode of cognition is like knowing facts and knowing details, and then the unfocused mode is when that stuff just becomes automated, and just being conscious of that, so that understanding frequently stuff that just feels automated was originally learned, and to reach like a next level insight or a next level capability, frequently you have to let go of what's been automated and become more conscious of your own mental processes. Yeah, it's interesting stuff. Like I think the language is interesting. Is it again a Lewis Carroll thing? I mean, I was trying to. That was an unbirthday party?
Yeah, it's more Lewis Carroll. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Just plus one. I was thinking the same thing. I think has that non-obvious surprise factor to it. I think, in fact, if you were to try to describe it in more positive language, and this is not intended as a workshop, this when especially our listeners can't engage with me. But if you're like purposeful relearning,
mm-hmm.
I think that'd be worse in terms of a catchy, having a hook than unlearning.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Because I hopefully for most folks, unlearning prompts some version of this conversation. Actually, like, do they think about, is unlearning forgetting? I don't think so. Although, like, barnacles and hulls in there, like there's, as you sail further on the seas, like there is more forgetting, and that can be a version of unlearning.
Sure.
But it's not just that. It's like it's being really purposeful about that. So I think it's a pretty pithy hook there on the unlearning side. A couple other thoughts. it's hard to do the unlearning part. And I think that's why it's, something that's in the zeitgeist now, with the example of the health professionals still continuing to do things that they know, or that there's research that says is not the right thing to do. From South by, I was at a session with Claire Cook from McGraw-Hill, who is a learning specialist there, and she presented on 5 neuromyths. So having done a show on myths and busting some of them, I was excited to attend. And she did cover the myths that we had covered. There are a couple other extras, which I thought were pretty neat. The Mozart effect, like, does playing classical music make, either in utero or for children or for adults, does it make you smarter? It's interesting on that one. I'll come back to my point in a second, but on that one, until then, I will say more words.
Please.
Like, there was this research, there was a study done in the 90s that showed, in sort of a lab setting, showed that it did. And this sprung out this whole like set of toys for children, learning products, etc. That research has been debunked. And so there are like multiple times that they've tried to replicate this piece of science, this finding, and they haven't been able to do so. And so that is now considered to be debunked. And yet, like, there's all of these, again, toys, educational products, et cetera, that still have a life because of this. Baby Mozart. Yeah. Like, there are these things that exist, and in fact, there's no good research. You should unlearn that.
Yeah, until it's bunked again.
Until it's rebunked. Yeah. The thing that was interesting, this was the point that I'm now coming back to, is that in her slides, Carol Cook presented the percentage of the general population that believes this, the percentage of educators, and the percentage of people with high neuroscience exposure. So for something like the 10% of the brain myth, which was the one that she led off with, that one, if I'm just checking my stats, so 36% of the general population believes that, 33% of educators, and 14% of people with high neuroscience exposure.
Yeah.
Versus the learning styles one.
Right.
Which is 93% of the general population, 76% of educators, and 78% of people with high neuroscience exposure. So, I think you touched on this before, but just to offer some recent from South by evidence that even people who, when presented with the science behind that says this was never bunked or it's subsequently been debunked,
right,
people are like, yeah, but I'm still going to go with what I think.
Right.
Like the unlearning part, you have to be humble. You have to really want to be committed to doing it, because absent a better process where you're constantly interrogating what you believe, like, you believe what you believe.
Totally. Right. I love where you're going with the neuroscience exposure. Almost sounds like Peter Parker in the science lab, and he was exposed to raw neuroscience.
That's right.
And then who knows what happens after that happens.
Now his spidey senses are up.
Exactly.
It's a lot of ignoring our own personal experience to an extent, right? Like, I've experienced that I learn best by X, and for me to then say learning styles don't exist, I need to unlearn my own personal biases, which probably is the hardest thing to unlearn. Brown University, in fact, has an interesting course that came out in the fall called Unlearning Toxic Masculinity. And so that, I know Rohit has some writing on that for the non-obvious. And I think pop culture may be the wrong thing, but in sort of trending news, that's obviously another way they're using this word, unlearning, but this is more about a personal trait or how one was raised. It's not about medicine. It's not about math. It's about sort of a personality trait or the way we may act amongst people. And Mike, I find that an interesting use of this word, that they're sort of trying to, and I'll use this, in my opinion, reprogram people in a way to think differently about how they may act in public or with other people. Yeah,
no, I think that's a really interesting analogy too, because it does remind me of addiction and behavior change, right? So like a lot of the behavioral rituals that we sort of fall prey to and maybe routinize to the point where getting back to the point of, it almost becomes an automatic behavior. I'm no longer conscious of what I'm doing. Frequently, those are the things that benefit from unlearning to kind of break the behavioral rut, the routine. And I think lots of times that requires awareness that I can choose to do this or not to do it. And rather than just unconsciously snap into a routine that is maybe unconscious, I instead can become conscious of my own behavior. And that's where I think, regardless of the what's good or bad about the body of research that we've been looking at, I do think that idea of increasing some of the self-awareness around your own behavior to the point that if you're doing something that just comes naturally because you've done it for many, many years, I think there is an elevating of consciousness that happens when you realize I'm doing this because I'm allowing myself to fall into that subroutine, as opposed to saying I'm intentionally doing it. Because when you're first learning something, you have to be very conscious of, when you're first learning to drive, always a great example, you're very conscious of every step in the procedure to drive. And then by the time it becomes automated, you're really not thinking, well, it becomes automated next level so that you're not even driving, but that's a separate conversation. But the idea that, the cognitive intent to perform a behavior, in some ways, what makes us so good is the idea that it can all become these sort of subconscious subroutines that we just snap into. But I think the concept of unlearning reminds us that there's a higher level of awareness that says, I'm going to kick into that subroutine. I'm going to accept that the stuff that I learned is more valuable, and I'm just going to like kick it off, as opposed to, almost getting back to that initial consciousness where like I'm first acquiring the skill. It does remind me a little bit of the whole mindfulness movement too, like where if you're actually very present in the moment, I think you become more aware of the constituent behaviors that sort of drive higher level functioning. So yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting when you start thinking about it, how it ties to addiction or implicit bias or a lot of the things that behaviors that people are trying to break themselves out of. In some ways, they do need to go back to the drawing board to a certain extent and kind of unwind their learning.
And mentioned before, I do think there's a direct tie-in with growth mindset in a way here. I will admit I had to unlearn the way I learned math in elementary school to help my daughter. I had to just forget about the way I learned to be able to relearn the way they're teaching it now, to then be able to help her with her homework, which was something that, I'll be honest, took a little letting go of my pride and letting go of the fact I know how to do this, to then have her show me, maybe research a little bit. I looked up some YouTube videos, Brandon, and came back to a place where I felt like, okay, I can now learn the new way. Do you see that as part of the generational aspect? Like we talked about the grandparents telling us how to parent 40 years later, or is it simply just the changing landscape of learning that we just need to constantly be open to the idea that things are going to be different as we learn new things?
Yeah, I don't know that that's an either or. I definitely think that we should, Mike used the word humility before, I think repeated that. I think that's really important, that you should just assume that many of the things that you believe to be true, whether it's through, you learned them once or you have deep expertise, may or may not end up being true. And I think that just that general approach to your learning and your life will lead you to be just a better member of society. So I don't, I think the grandparents offering parenting advice, it's actually sometimes a lack of humility that they can't imagine that something that was true 40, 50 years ago is no longer true. And I think if they, and I'm talking to you, Mom, if they, if they were open to the fact that things have changed, it's not that they should jettison all of their parenting advice, nor actually, Dan, do I imagine you're jettisoning all of your math experience. It's that you need to have, it's a vulnerability actually to say, I am not expert in this. Even if I once was, I need to learn new ways of doing that. But then you can marry that with the experience that you do have to, I think, make something that's really powerful. And I think even just another South by example, the keynote on day 3 was Skip Gates, who's a professor of AFAM studies at Harvard, and Paula Kerger, who's the president and CEO of PBS, talking about a new show that they have, a 4-hour special on Reconstruction. And it's American history. They made a point that this isn't a Black history show being released in February. It's American history being released in April. They showed a little clip of it. Looks great. But Skip Gates, asked the audience sort of what they learned about Reconstruction and did they learn about redemption. And I went to high school in the early 90s in Ohio, and you learned a lot about the Civil War and then quickly ran through what happened right after it. And even though I need to have the humility to unlearn or relearn something about what actually happened in that time, the fact that I learned something different, I think actually is itself interesting and can be a new learning opportunity. What was that telling me about the empowered majority who was writing the textbooks at the time? What does that mean about how I would want things to change before my child is educated? So again, I don't think it's a deletion. It's a you're sort of growing from something that you had before, and it's an enrichment, not a deletion. So I don't know that answered your question, Dan, but that's generally my take on it.
I think it did, and I the way as you both talked, it reminds me of a computer, right? You're not necessarily deleting the file and getting rid of it forever. You're rewriting. It's a rewrite on a script. It's a rewrite on a term paper where you're editing and you're changing maybe a little bit or a lot of it, but you're aware of it. And I think that's what you both have said so well, is that if we are aware of this and aware of our shortcomings or lack of knowledge or lack of expertise, I think that's a great way to take this into consideration, make it part of how we go about learning. Mike, any final thoughts here as we close out the Unlearning show?
Not really. I think at times we've talked about getting your learn on. So there may be times where you need to get your unlearn on. So be open to when stuff you were certain about gets shook, and actually try to lean into that experience and view that as a genuine growth opportunity. Is something I think we'll all try to remind ourselves of. And I thought that was definitely sort of emblematic of the research.
Brandon, how about yourself?
Yeah, I want to give myself credit for having made it all the way to the end of this pod without making the reference I'm about to, which is you can't have an unlearning show without the Yoda reference.
Oh, sure.
You must unlearn what you have learned. So he was unlearned for what? He was getting that in the zeitgeist
years ago.
That was an Empire Strikes Back quote. This is before Yoda got weird in the 90s.
It was he was the height of his powers.
He was, this was when George Lucas was at the height of his powers, I think. Before, I wish he had done some unlearning. But yeah, look, I really believe in this. I think this is, again, I'm not as close to the actual science behind, and I'm interested in getting closer, but I think this is really important. I believe that we're on sort of a lifelong learning journey. And if you think that you don't want to revisit destinations you've been to in the past, you know everything about them, that you're missing out. So I'm glad people are talking about it.
Great topic. One I'm sure we'll come back to, much like we do with generations and growth mindset, that will weave into future shows as we discuss through 2019 here on Trending Education. As always, you can find us at trendingeducation.com. You can find us on Twitter at trendinganded. Same on Facebook. Love to hear from you on things you have unlearned, or whether or not this is a new word for you and something that you look forward to learning about more in the future. Share the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher, wherever you may listen, with a colleague, with a friend. We'd appreciate that greatly. And of course, you can share what we share over there on Twitter or on Facebook. We'll be back with you next Tuesday, as we always are, right here with a brand new episode of Trending in Education.